Welcome to Ruins and Haunting Heritage. My name is Dr. April Bisa. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Vassar College, and this is my archaeology seminar for the fall 2020 semester. In this lecture, we're going to go over something I wrote. It's a book chapter called Ghost Hunting as Archaeology, Archaeology as Ghost Hunting, and it appears in the book Lost City, Found Pyramid, which is edited by Jeb Card from our Spooky Archaeology, and also David Anderson. So this is a book where each chapter has a different author, and these chapters include one by Stacy Dunn on witches, shamans, and looters, one on David Anderson, which is about race and racism and pseudo-archaeology. There's one about reality TV and the archaeology and pseudo-archaeology on reality TV. So there's lots of great things in this book, and the chapter that I decided to contribute to it was based on my personal exploration of the difference between archaeology and ghost hunting that has included students for almost a decade now. Wow, time flies. And in some other videos specifically associated with this course, I've posted footage of some of the ghost hunts that I've done with students. Done lots of ghost tours with students as well. So I try to take this firsthand knowledge of what people are looking for from ghost stories and from archaeology, and try to find a middle ground where they both exist and they both give people what they're looking for without lying, without deceiving, without misrepresenting the past or the present in any way. So I start this chapter, and it's harder to talk about your own chapter than it is to talk about somebody else's chapter, because clearly I thought everything in here was important, so that's why I put it here. But you're going to read it anyway, probably, so you'll be fine getting all the details. But I started off with trying to talk about why archaeology, as it exists for archaeologists who are trained and usually in academic or professional settings that archaeology is their job, why that is so different from what people want archaeology to be when they watch TV or see movies or even read the newspaper. Do you say paper anymore, or just say the news, because it's not on paper? Sidebar. Anyway, so I say here that London's Times newspaper recently published an article proclaiming that archaeology is at its most gripping when it uncovers enigmas for which there is no explanation. However, archaeologists are in the business of investigation and ideally explanation of human behavior, not in documenting unsolvable mysteries. So the role of an archaeologist is to figure things out, but people generally don't want us to figure things out. They want the mystery to persist. So when the public is interested in real archaeology, their attraction actually seems centered on a fascination with the origins of humanity, with buried treasure, with the challenges of interpreting evidence, and with the thrill of discovering artifacts and monuments of past societies. So that summary of what people want from archaeology comes from Gabe Moshenko and his article on the uncanny and archaeology. So this expectation that the public has of archaeology being thrills and chills causes there to be this very high bar of what archaeologists should be doing versus what archaeologists are actually doing. But it also helps to establish what happens in site tours, museum displays, and other forms of public archaeology. Lots of people who meet me think that I'm a bad archaeologist because I don't work in Egypt and I don't work on mummies. So why wouldn't you? What's the point of being an archaeologist if you're not going to do that? When that sort of stuff is fine and cool, but I don't think it's the most interesting thing that I could be doing, or the thing that I could be doing that makes a difference in the world. I like to think that the archaeology I do makes a difference, and telling more stories about Egypt and mummies, I think, just tells more stories about something that there's already many stories about. So what I tried to do in this article is explain where archaeology and ghost hunting actually overlap. And this overlap is to me very significant, in that we could start to think about how we could bridge that gap, so that archaeologists are using places and things, sites and artifacts are our technical terms, to tell stories about what happened there at that space in the past. And my viewing of ghost hunting shows in particular is that that's what they do. They go to a place, and the first thing you see is an expert come out, usually the property owner or somebody who manages the building, and they tell the story of the place. And it's a kind of story that is different from what an archaeologist might tell, in that dates are relative. Instead of, in 1597 this happened, in 1598 that happened, right? The dates are, before this happened and then after that happened, which is much more memorable, and it keeps the story flowing more and better. Because when you say a date to somebody who doesn't know what happened in that date, it's part of their mythical time, there you get a sense of, wait, am I supposed to know what was going on that year in 1597? I don't know what was going on in 1597. So it's automatically off-putting. But in America, we like to say things like before the Civil War, after the Civil War, versus how many people actually know what happened at what year of the Civil War. And therefore, saying 1862 doesn't mean too much to people, but saying before the Civil War, after the Civil War is much more meaningful. So in that way, ghost hunting and the ghost hunter mode of collecting information is much more engaging than what archaeologists tend to do. They also, they heavily edit these shows, and they edit them when they know, what is the story we're going to tell. So they look for a story that is a story that's compelling, and then they toss out all of the extraneous information. So what is left when you watch a ghost hunting show is only the information you need to understand the evidence they're going to show you. And the evidence that they show you is also heavily edited. So one of the things I put on YouTube is some unedited video of my students and I ghost hunting at Vassar College in the basement. And other than our dialogue, you have no idea what's going on, right? It's disconnected from the ghost stories of that same building, and there are many ghost stories of that same building. So it's not as satisfying to view, right? The way ghost hunters have put their story together and packaged it is much better than how most archaeologists or most historians or most science communicators in general have learned to package their stories. There's also a sense in ghost hunting that I will tell you what my techniques are as I'm doing my techniques. I will pull out an EMF detector and I will tell you what this does, but not in a huge amount of detail, just in enough detail that you can understand the readings that are coming back. So science in general, and archaeology in particular, we use a lot of tools and techniques. And a lot of these tools and techniques are beyond the understanding of most people, because they don't understand that archaeologists use tools and techniques. Right? There's a lot of computers in archaeology, but that's never the idea of how archaeology is presented. But when we do tell people about our tools and techniques, we tend to come across as pompous, that this is something you could barely understand, so let me dumb it down for you. But in ghost hunting, they use very fancy infrared cameras and so forth, and they explain quickly and easily what it does, the kind that you need to know to see when you see the evidence that it gives you what it needs to do. So a lot of this chapter that I wrote is that sort of, how do we see how ghost hunting and ghost tours and the paranormal is actually creating stories about how the past is still alive in the present, but putting it in a way that people understand, get excited about, and want to retell better than archaeologists and scientists generally do it. So I have a whole section in here on storytelling, and I quote Cornelius Holtorf, who's an archaeologist here, where I say, archaeology, once the stuff of exciting stories, seems to have taken on the unfathomable labels of boring and tedious. Lots of people tell me that they were excited about archaeology in college, and they took a class, and then they realized it was boring and tedious. Is it that archaeology is boring and tedious, or that class was boring and tedious? Hopefully this class is not boring or tedious. But I also talk about how archaeologists kind of help to create that boring and tedious understanding of their own profession as a way of keeping other people out, right? To be like, oh, no, I'm a scientist. It's hard to understand what I do. Right? So just like in Jeb Card's Spooky Archaeology, how much of archaeology has created its own bad image, right? As much as how much has archaeology created the need for paranormal and mythical stories because people don't understand what the archaeology is doing. So I say, unlike professionals, non-archaeologists are not concerned with accuracy. Yet they do not want to be intentionally deceived. So a big problem that archaeologists have of even talking about things like ghost hunting is their knee-jerk reaction is, well, you're perpetuating these ideas of ancient aliens and all of that sort of stuff. And if we don't talk about it, we're actually perpetuating it. If we come across as that being wrong and not part of what we do, then we don't have any authority to critique it. So in my version of archaeology as ghost hunting, you don't mislead people, you don't lie to people, you don't make things up. But what you do is you tell archaeological stories that are based on evidence, based on actual things that happened, and you do it in a way that's more interesting and engaging. And if that's the wrong thing to do to make your research more interesting and engaging, then I'm happy to be doing it the wrong way. So one of the things that I use in here is my experience when I was teaching in Ohio, in a little town called Tiffin. My experience of bringing students into archaeological investigations that includes ghost hunting as part of it. So when I first got to the town, like literally the first day, people were like, oh, you're an archaeologist, there's this house that they're gonna knock down and it needs to be preserved. And yeah, cool, fine, I will help if I can. And when I started asking questions about why it needs to be preserved, what's the history of the house, very few people had very important things to say as far as what actually happened there, other than, well, it's always been there and I like it. So I was teaching in their honors program, and one of their honors program themes was courses in how to be a citizen. So I used, well, if we're going to save a building, let's talk about whether or not it's eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And this is the main mechanism by which archaeologists who are professionals can preserve buildings and sites. So we needed to know a history of the place. We needed to understand who built it, what it was part of, what was the landscape like, to find out, right, what are the stories it has to tell. So one of the things we did was excavation in the yard around the house. We did some shovel test bits, we did some test units, and we uncovered parts of a greenhouse. And the building itself was an octagon house, an octagon-shaped house. And it was made in the architectural style of Orson Squire Fowler, who perpetuated the octagon house movement of the mid-1800s. Right? So now you get to the point where I'm starting to get into that tedious story. But there are great aspects of this, and that Fowler was actually the founder of phrenology, the feeling the lumps on people's heads to figure out who they are and what their natural tendencies are. And Fowler actually started his octagon house stuff right here in the Hudson Valley, in the area of Wappingers, just south of Vassar campus, is where he built his 5-story octagon house. And Fowler is actually buried in an unmarked grave in the Bronx, because he died after scandal, because he used his phrenology to talk about sex between unmarried people. And he has a book where you could actually see the illustrations and stuff. He developed a way of using phrenology to figure out if somebody had had sex or not in their lifetimes. Right, so this is a very interesting person, and for people to have created their houses to follow his ideas. So he wrote this book in the mid-1800s about how the octagon house is the most democratic form of a house anybody can make. You could build it yourself because it's self-standing. You don't need a lot of machinery. And one of the things he advocated was to always have a greenhouse attached. We found a greenhouse. It's in that style, right? So whoever built this house was very much thinking about the same things that Orson Fowler was thinking about. Whether or not they were thinking about the phrenology stuff, we could get to that. But it turns out that the people who tended to build octagon houses tend to be mathematicians, and at that time period. So they were thinking more than just about the building layout, right? They were thinking more about all the ideas that come together. So anyway, I was teaching this class about this house that people wanted to save, and we did some archaeology. We interviewed people who had lived there in the past. We did some architectural analysis. And a lot of this is very you need a lot of knowledge about architecture and a lot of knowledge about archaeology and artifacts to be able to grab hold on why each little piece of information is important. So one of the things that we did was we went ghost hunting. And we went on a nighttime with our EMF detectors, with our EVP readings and things like that, in small groups. And as usually happens to me, it turned out that it was a night that it was thunderstorming. So we started this course on this octagon house with me asking the students what they thought about the octagon house and whether it should be saved. And most students were like, octagon house? There's an octagon house? I've never seen it before. And we were literally in a classroom where you could see it out the window, and they had walked past it to come to class. And they didn't care about it at all. When we did the archaeology, they thought the archaeology was cool, but they still didn't care about the house. Once we did the ghost hunting, they started caring about that house. We spent time there at night, which was a time of day that people generally don't go into abandoned buildings. We did things, we asked questions, we asked if the spirits of the people who we had known had lived there and had passed on were there. So we used all the knowledge that we had accumulated through our more scientific and academic pursuits, and we tried to apply it to the noises we were hearing, the senses we were feeling. And at one point, during the thunderstorm, in the dark, with just our flashlights that are either red or green, depending on what setting we put them in. We had gone upstairs, and the house was near a road, so it was a little noisy. So I suggested that one of the students go into a closet and do the electronic voice phenomenon, the EVP session in there, so that the sounds would be isolated. So she was in there and she was asking questions, is anybody here? And the rest of us were outside the closet, because it was a small closet. But I hadn't noticed that one of the students had kind of slacked off a bit and wasn't with us. So that student was coming up the stairs. And as she reached the top of the stairs, the student that was in the closet decided to come out. And the student who was coming up the stairs, she got scared because she had no idea that one of our team members was in the closet. And we all had a great laugh at that. Luckily, she wasn't anywhere close to the stairs at that point that she could have fallen down and hurt herself. But just thinking about how being in the place that you're studying, how getting to use the knowledge that you have about the place. We did some Ouija board stuff, and that was people who signed up specifically to do the Ouija board. I didn't force it on anybody. How that created more of this phenomenology, that we felt connected to the place in a different way. So further on in the class, and there's a picture of the house on page 195 for you to get your own phenomenology of it. We had our academic aspects of the class, and they had to do a tour. And it wasn't a ghost tour, it was just a tour of the house. So many people in the community really wanted this house saved, but had never been in the house and had always wondered about the house. So we advertised a specific day that turned out to be a beautifully sunny, warm day, that anybody in the community, anybody in the town, anybody could come get a tour of the house by the students. And the students developed their own tours that could include the architectural information, the archaeology information, the archival information, and the ghost hunts that we did. And we just stood outside the front of the house, and as groups of 4 or 5 people arrived, they would get assigned to a student, and the student would take them on a tour through the house. And then the people would come back out, and other people had been going in with another student, and the people came out and they had such a good time touring this house with the student that they wanted to go on another tour. And it worked because each student had created their own tour of what was important to them, right? They were conveying their own phenomenology of this place. So some people in the community actually went on multiple tours of the same relatively small house, just because they wanted to know more. Right? This is very different from the way that academia usually is. Well, if you want to know about this house, here's an interpretive panel. Nobody reads an interpretive panel twice. It's static. It's very selective. It's not this organic, well, what do you think? Well, what do you think? So these tours went very well. They were very successful, to the point that the president of the college at the time promised that he would make sure that the house was not torn down. This was a decade ago, so I do not know what the current status of the house is and its relation to the college. So fast forward a bit, it was our final exam, and this was a course, so they had to write an essay, and we were in the classroom, and it was like 3 days before Christmas, and very cold outside, and everybody did their little essay, and I said, okay, well, if you want to go, you could go. If anyone wants to go to the house one more time, come with me. Every single student chose to stay and go to the house one more time. And they took pictures of each other outside of the house, inside of the house. They were hugging the walls, and they started telling me that around the time that they did their tours, they started to come to the house and sit on the front porch to do their homework. That the house became like their place, and they couldn't get inside without me. I had the keys, they did not have the keys. But they felt this connection, they felt this ownership. So I believe that this is what archaeologists are trying to do. They're trying to convey this sense of place to people, to make people understand that, you know, the past of places is part of its present aliveness. But how do we convey that past to contribute to the present aliveness without being able to tell stories that are actually meaningful? So for the class for today that is happening in person at Vassar, our activity for this week, week 4, we're actually going to be looking deeper into the county poorhouse and insane asylum for Dutchess County, New York, and some of the preservation work that I've been part of there. There's also been a lot of demolition work that's been going on. They recently knocked down most of the buildings of the original asylum and poorhouse. And what the Vassar students and I are trying to do is help preserve the cemetery, where possibly up to 1,000 people are buried. There's only a couple hundred markers, and the markers are deteriorating, and they don't have names, they have numbers, but we know who some of these people are behind the numbers. So we're going to try to see, you know, how we can develop a little bit of a sense of place within our own group that's taking this course of that poorhouse cemetery. And when I originally was planning this course, we were going to go there, but now with pandemic rules, we can't actually go there. So it's going to be a little more challenging to do it within the classroom. So that's my summary of ghost hunting as archaeology and archaeology as ghost hunting. That doesn't have to be about the paranormal. It can just be about learning from the people who are making the past come alive, whether that be paranormal or not for people, and being able to create a better archaeology that allows the past to come alive without lying, without deceiving, without promoting any sort of ideas about superiority or inferiority. Just, you know, let's tell good stories about places, and let's make people understand why they're special and why they're important.